A young street vendor is kicked off the sidewalk until a millionaire buys it all and turns her into a businesswoman. The street was bustling on a sunny New York afternoon, but everyone's eyes were fixed on the humiliating scene. A young woman in worn clothes, balancing a small crate of fresh fruit, was being pushed mercilessly by a security guard in a black suit. "This is no place for people like you," he shouted, ripping off her wares and scattering them across the sidewalk. The oranges tumbled across the ground, trampled by passers-by who laughed or turned away in disdain. The girl kneeling tried to pick up each piece, tears burning her face. One woman whispered to another, "Look, you think you can sell in the rich neighborhood, how daring." The sensation was of public shame, a wound exposed before hundreds of eyes that treated her as invisible, except for their cruelty. The young woman's breath trembled, but in her gaze a silent resistance began to glow like a flame. Hidden beneath ashes, just as the security guard raised his hand to expel her once and for all, a deep voice echoed behind him. "How much does this whole box cost?" Silence filled the street. A man in an impeccable suit, a watch glinting in the sun, and a steady gaze stopped before the scene. Those present recognized him immediately. Richard Coleman, one of the most influential investors in the country. The security guard froze, stuttering, as Richard bent down to pick up an apple from the ground and hand it to the young woman. "I'll buy it all right now for triple the price," he said, without taking his eyes off her, who could hardly believe it. The crowd, previously jeering, murmured in confusion. In seconds, the unexpected gesture shattered the logic of that humiliation, inverting the scene as if in a mirror. The poor girl was no longer invisible and became the center of a revelation no one would dare forget. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. New York City was in a rush. Cars honked, yellow taxis darted across the avenues, and hurried pedestrians paraded with coffees in hand and headphones in, as if every second were part of an invisible choreography. In the heart of this organized chaos rose glass and steel buildings, reflecting the autumn sky in cool golden hues, while illuminated storefronts displayed luxury brands that seemed to exist in a distant world, unreachable for many. And it was precisely in this contrast that the scene unfolded. A young woman, with her hair tied in a hasty bun, simple clothes and firm steps, carried a small makeshift wooden box, where fresh fruit lay carefully lined up. There was no booth, no tarp, just the sidewalk and hope. She settled there, between a jewelry boutique and an elegant cafe, as if silently defying the rules of that space that seemed reserved only for those who could afford it. The cold air blew against her skin, but she smiled as she offered apples and oranges to passers-by, her soft voice trying to drown out the incessant noise of the city. Few stopped. Some ignored her, others looked at her with disdain, as if her presence were a blemish on the scene of wealth. Still, she remained, lifting her chin, each piece of fruit wiped with a cloth, as if it were a small treasure deserving of respect. At the same time, across the street, a luxury black car parked discreetly. The metallic reflection of the bodywork seemed to clash with the simplicity of the vendor's scene, and from within emerged a man of imposing presence. Richard Coleman, with his perfectly tailored suit, gleaming shoes, and a posture that conveyed a natural sense of power, walked toward the elegant cafe. His eyes, trained on business, barely noticed the young woman at first, but the city seemed to conspire to bring together universes that should never intersect. As he entered a meeting, the young woman arranged her box, breathing deeply, as if each fruit sold were one step closer to the abyss of poverty. The atmosphere carried a silent tension, that of the world of those racing against the clock and those fighting hunger. Two realities sharing the same street, about to collide in a story that would transform both their lives. She wasn't born among skyscrapers or glittering storefronts. Her world was made up of narrow streets and old buildings in a forgotten Bronx neighborhood, where the cracked asphalt told stories of abandonment. From a young age, she learned that nothing came for free. Her father had disappeared when she was still a child, leaving behind only the echo of broken promises. Her overworked mother cleaned houses that gleamed with luxury, while her own kitchen remained nearly empty. The girl grew up witnessing the cruel contrast, cleaning lavish tables while her own table at home offered only cold rice and beans. Yet there was a strength within her that was shaped by the silence of need. She learned to work early. She sold candy at the school gates, carried bags for neighbors, and babysat younger children. The world saw her as invisible, but her eyes held a spark of resilience. To every humiliation, every look of pity, she responded with a firm smile, not out of naivete, but because she had discovered that giving in to bitterness was giving fate a victory it didn't deserve. In the winters, she remembered nights sleeping in a borrowed coat, her body hunched over, while listening to rats crawling through the walls of her apartment. In the summers, she walked miles in, the sun selling fruit she bought cheaply at the market, always hoping to earn a few dollars to ease her mother's bills. School, which could have been a refuge, was the scene of other kinds of pain. Classmates mocked her worn clothes, her worn shoes, and she pretended not to care, though deep down she longed to disappear. But there was also something about her that others didn't understand, a calm in her eyes, a quiet dignity that no amount of contempt could erase. This calm came from the nights she spent alone reading books borrowed from the public library, dreaming of worlds beyond the neighborhood's bars. She grew up with invisible scars, not from explicit violence, but from the everyday indifference that cuts deeper. When she turned 18, her mother fell ill, and the weight of survival fell squarely on her shoulders. Low-paying jobs, long hours, rude customers. She endured all of this without complaint. It was as if she carried within her a silent promise that she would not be crushed by the fate the city seemed to reserve for the poor. Deep down, however, there was a thread of constant pain, the feeling that the world was always pushing her away from the places she dreamed of being. And it was with this past etched in her every gesture that years later she stood on the wealthy sidewalk with her crate of fruit, unaware that she was about to be pushed again, but also to become, against all odds, part of a story that would change her life forever. That morning, the Upper East Side Street was busier than usual. A grand opening was drawing attention. The neighborhood's most exclusive coffee shop was opening its doors, attracting journalists, influencers, and curious onlookers. The ambiance exuded sophistication. Modern chandeliers reflected off glass walls. Waiters served glasses of sparkling wine, and customers chatted loudly about million-dollar deals. Outside, a group of young heirs, sons of businessmen and bankers, smoked expensive cigars, laughing at everything and everyone they passed. Among them, Thomas, a longtime friend of Richard Coleman, displayed his usual air of superiority. Upon spotting the young woman with her fruit crate set up a few feet in front of the entrance, he let out a mocking laugh. "Look, someone brought a piece of the Bronx to the Fifth Avenue window," he said, drawing laughter from the group. One of them, bored, launched a poisonous idea that spread quickly. "Let's make a bet. I'll bet you $100,000 that no one here, has the guts to make her leave this sidewalk without calling the police. It has to be in front of everyone, and it has to be quick." Their eyes met, enticed by the promise of easy entertainment. The prize wasn't the money. For them, $100,000 was just a pocketbook whim, but the spectacle of public humiliation. Thomas, always eager to prove himself, accepted instantly. "Leave it to me. She'll run before the clock strikes 10. The group spread out discreetly, pretending to chat, but keeping their eyes fixed on the scene as if waiting for a cruel play to begin. The young woman, oblivious to the conspiracy, gently adjusted her cheekbones, trying to ignore the hostile looks. Thomas approached, a cold smile on his lips. He stood before her, as if he were a king observing an intruder. "You know you're in the wrong place, don't you? This isn't the Bronx. This is the territory of people who are worth something." With each word, he let his voice rise high enough for those present to hear. The he Girl stared at him silently, without lowering her eyes, and this only increased his theatrical fury. The reason for the humiliation was set. It wasn't about oranges nor public space. It was a bet, a dirty game of power, where her dignity was the betting chip, and the audience was made up of laughing strangers ready to see blood. The clock ticked, the stares multiplied, and her fate seemed once again to be decided not by her strength, but by the sadism of those who had never had to fight for survival. The buzz of the bet still echoed when Richard left the cafe. He had just come from a boring meeting, but his expression was as imposing as ever. The Swiss watch gleamed on his wrist, his shoes reflected the streetlights like mirrors, and his every step seemed to cut through the crowd. The group of heirs moved discreetly away, but their eyes remained fixed on him, as if sensing something unexpected was about to happen. Richard was unaware of the bet, nor of the muffled laughter. He only saw ahead, the young woman kneeling, trying to rescue her fruit from the ground. The contrast hit him like a punch. On one side, the sidewalk perfumed by the newly opened cafe. On the other, the citrus aroma of the fruit crushed against the asphalt. He stopped. The silence that fell around him seemed impossible in New York, but there it was, every gaze fixed, waiting for his next move. The young woman, her hair loosely falling around her face, looked up to meet his gaze. There was restrained anger, wounded dignity, but no plea. This detail disconcerted him. Richard was accustomed to seeing subjects in every gaze, employees who obeyed, partners who fawned over him, even adversaries who retreated in his presence. But that poor girl, kneeling on the ground, didn't flinch. There was no fear in her eyes. The security guard, noticing his boss's gaze, tried to step forward. "She shouldn't be here, sir. She's blocking the store entrance. I was just taking care of it." Richard interrupted him, with a tiny gesture of his hand, as if ordering silence without words. Then he bent down, ignoring the cold asphalt against the knee of his expensive suit, and picked up an uneaten apple that had rolled onto the street. He wiped it with the white handkerchief from his pocket and held it out to her. "Are you selling?" The question sounded simple, but each syllable seemed to carry the weight of the entire scene. The young woman hesitated. She knew there was something theatrical about it, that everyone was watching her as if it were a spectacle. Still, she answered, "Yes, each for $1." Richard raised his eyebrows. $1. In his world, that amount wouldn't even buy a sip of imported water. But here, in her firm voice, it seemed to contain so much more. "I'll take them all." The sentence shattered the air like glass. The crowd murmured. The group of heirs exchanged anxious glances, and Thomas clenched his fists. The girl blinked in surprise, almost in disbelief. Richard opened his wallet and pulled out not just enough bills to cover the fruit, but triple that. He placed the money in the makeshift wooden box, as if sealing a contract. And then he added, "Consider this an investment. I want to see you here tomorrow too." He didn't smile, didn't make a gesture of exaggerated kindness. He simply spoke with the naturalness of someone who decides fate. Her heart raced. Hers, because she would never have expected that the first contact between the two would be marked by so much astonishment, and his because he had never imagined that a simple street vendor could destabilize his world with just the firmness of a silent gaze. The next day, the scene seemed to repeat itself. The young woman returned to the same sidewalk, carrying her crate of fruit again, but this time something was different. The stares. People who had ignored her the day before now stopped to watch. Some whispered, others pointed discreetly. The gesture of Richard Coleman, the respected millionaire, had transformed a simple street vendor into a target of curiosity. The group of heirs, poisoned by wounded pride, did not accept defeat so easily. Thomas, in particular, had fury etched on his face. The bet had not been just a joke, it was the stage for his vanity. And being defeated by a poor girl who hadn't even uttered a word of supplication was unbearable. He engineered a cruel spectacle. As he approached, he feigned kindness. He bought an apple, turned it over in his hands as if it were a fragile object, and smiled contemptuously. "They say you now have a powerful investor. What luck, huh? Maybe you can even trade that old crate for a decent stall." Her loud voice drew the attention of customers, journalists, and even onlookers snapping photos with their cell phones. The young woman, firm, simply replied, "I don't need pity. I just need to sell." It was enough to incite the cruelty. Thomas lifted the apple into the air and dropped it to the ground, crushing it with the sole of his shiny shoe. "Oops, looks like your product isn't as durable as you think." Laughter echoed, complicit in the humiliation. The girl felt heat rise to her face, but she didn't cry. She simply bent down, picked up the remains of the fruit, and put them back in the box. It was as if her every gesture was a silent challenge to his cruelty. Then, in a final move, Thomas raised his voice. "Don't think this millionaire will always save you. He tires easily of new toys." The words fell like blades. Some of the crowd laughed, some fell silent, but the damage was done. The young woman turned, looked him in the eye with disarming calm, and said, "The difference between us is that I've already learned to survive without anything. You, without your privileges, wouldn't last a day." The silence was immediate, but it didn't last. Thomas laughed, trying to regain control. For him, the humiliation was still hers. For those watching, dignity was beginning to shift. And Richard, watching from a distance, felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anger. Not just against Thomas's arrogance, but against the way the entire society seemed to condone the idea that wealth defined human worth. That public humiliation, marked by contempt, would not be forgotten. For her, it would be another scar on her soul. For him, it would be the trigger for a transformation he didn't yet understand. That same night, as the city lights reflected in the high windows and the noise of cars began to fade into a distant murmur, Richard sought out the young woman. There was something about her that bothered him, something that didn't fit the narrative he'd always believed about the poor and the rich. He found her in a small side alley, sorting through the unsold fruit. She seemed calm, almost indifferent to the storm of humiliation she'd endured hours earlier. He approached slowly, expecting to see her grateful for his saving gesture the day before, but instead he found a steady gaze that seemed to already know everything that lurked behind it. Before he could say a word, she broke the silence. "You think I don't know? The bet, the laughter, the cheap show. I was there, listening to every word, even when they pretended I was invisible." Richard stood still, stunned. No one had ever dared speak to him like that. The young woman stood, holding an orange between her fingers, as if it were a symbol of resistance, and continued, "It wasn't kindness. It was ego. It was the chance to turn the tables and silence the noise of your circle of friends. I saw in their eyes the pleasure of seeing me humiliated, and in yours the desire to show power. But the difference is, I have nothing to lose." The silence between them weighed like iron. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt exposed. She knew everything, and yet she hadn't screamed, hadn't begged, hadn't sought revenge. She had simply kept the secret, waiting for the right moment to tell. There was a strange grandeur in her posture, not haughtiness, but dignity. "Why didn't you tell everyone?" he asked, barely recognizing his own voice. She sighed, looking away at the lit street. "Because they would never believe me, and because I don't need their approval. Life has taught me that silence is sometimes stronger than any scream." Richard felt a pang in his chest, not just guilt, but bewilderment. He was accustomed to controlling narratives, to shaping stories of business and power, but there, before that young woman, in simple clothes, he realized he had lost control. She knew everything, and instead of using this for revenge, she chose to simply look at him with that implacable calm that disarmed him more than any attack. It was in that moment that he understood. She didn't need him. She already had something within her that no amount of money could buy, the freedom to not live chained to what others thought. Richard couldn't get her words out of his mind. For days, between high-dollar meetings, formal, dinners and helicopter rides, the memory of that steady gaze haunted him. Until one rainy morning, upon arriving at his office in Manhattan's financial district, he found a brown envelope on his desk, left by an assistant. Inside was an old newspaper article, yellowed with age. The headline caught his eye: "Wall Street janitor's daughter survives bankruptcy that destroyed entire families," Richard read in silence, and as the lines unfolded, His blood ran cold. The article told of a humble woman who had worked as a cleaner in the offices of large companies, including his father's company. She had lost her job after a financial scandal that left hundreds of employees without a livelihood. The detail struck him like an arrow. The woman mentioned was the young saleswoman's mother. He vaguely remembered seeing her in the hallways, silent, invisible among the expensive suits. He had never imagined that a bankruptcy and a business decision by his family had pushed so many lives into the abyss, including that of the girl who now sold fruit on the street. He continued reading. He discovered that after the bankruptcy, his mother fell ill, and his daughter, still a teenager, had taken on the responsibility of supporting the household. It wasn't just a story of poverty. It was a direct wound linked to the Coleman family's own empire. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of the revelation crushed him. The girl knew. She had known from the beginning who he was, where he came from, and perhaps even what he represented in her life, the symbolic face of a system that had condemned her family to poverty. And yet, she had faced him without explicit hatred, only with the calm of someone who carries the truth in their heart. The realization had suddenly dawned on her. She wasn't just a random saleswoman. She was someone whose story was intertwined with his, a victim of the consequences of decisions made in luxury salons she'd never been invited to enter. Richard rose from his chair, walked to the window overlooking the city's glittering buildings, and felt for the first time in years the weight of his own surname like a chain. He understood then that their encounter was no coincidence. It was as if the past had returned, silent and relentless, to collect a debt no amount of money could repay. After the silent revelation, something changed in the rhythm of the days. Richard began walking the streets where he had previously encountered her, hoping to see that fruit crate again, that steady gaze that seemed to pierce him. But the sidewalk was empty. The young woman simply hadn't returned. For the first few days, he believed it was merely a momentary absence. Perhaps she was ill. Perhaps she had changed her store. But over time, the emptiness began to weigh almost unbearably. The silence of absence was louder than any encounter they had ever had. Richard, accustomed to living surrounded by people, realized that no company fulfilled him. Meetings became mechanical, trips seemed too long, gala dinners lost their flavor. He, who had always believed that power was about mastering numbers and buying wills, found himself powerless in the face of the disappearance of a young woman who possessed nothing but dignity. He discreetly tried to send people to look for her. An assistant searched poor neighborhoods and popular markets, but no one knew where she was. It was as if he had dissolved into the city, swallowed by the immensity of New York. At night, Richard found himself remembering minute details, the way she carefully cleaned each piece of fruit, as if she were delivering a gift, the way she lifted her chin when someone tried to humiliate her, the disconcerting calm when she told him she knew everything. That absence became a constant presence in his mind, and then came the profound unease. For the first time, he missed someone who didn't depend on him. He realized he couldn't buy her, couldn't control her, couldn't even predict her steps. Her absence was an abyss that revealed his own fragility. Rumors spread on the streets. Some said the mysterious saleswoman who had confronted the heirs of the wealthy had returned to the Bronx. Others, that she had left the city. But nothing was certain. Only one truth remained. Richard, accustomed to conquering everything, was discovering there was something he couldn't have, and that was precisely what consumed him. Her absence began to generate rumors not only among curious street people but also in powerful circles. The press, always hungry for stories that mixed luxury and tragedy, found an opening in the situation. A leaked photo showed Richard next to the young saleswoman, picking up a fallen apple. At first, the image was read as a noble gesture, but all it took was for Coleman's enemies to exploit it for everything to change. Headlines began to pop up. Millionaire or opportunist? Coleman buys dignity with blood money. Newspapers recalled the previous bankruptcy, which had hit poor families, and pointed the finger at him, as if he had staged a charity show to clean up his own image. Social media exploded. Videos of the gambling scene circulated with sarcastic captions. While they laugh, a girl fights for survival. Richard, accustomed to being untouchable, became a target of public scrutiny. Board meetings were hastily scheduled. Investors demanded explanations. Confidence in the Coleman empire began to crack. At a gala dinner, a traditional venue where he was revered, he heard whispers accusing him of cheap manipulation. Every glance that had once applauded him now carried suspicion. He tried in vain to explain that it hadn't been staged. But how could he prove intentions in a world that only saw figures? Her silence, her absence, made everything worse. Because without her voice, without her presence, no one believed his version. It was as if fate had reversed the tables. Now it was Richard who lived under the weight of public humiliation, exposed not by material poverty, but by the misery of collective distrust. His downfall came not in the form of immediate bankruptcy, but in the relentless judgment of social opinion. For the first time, the man who controlled contracts and bought reputations discovered that no amount of fortune could control the narrative of a truth that breathed without needing to be spoken. The following weeks were a silent passage for Richard. The city still greeted him with the same haste. Drivers still made room for his limousine. Employees still greeted him with reverence. But inside, something had broken. Social judgment had stripped away an invisible layer of power that had always shielded him. He now saw himself naked before the mirror. He was no longer the millionaire everyone saw, merely a man haunted by emptiness. The young woman's silence had become the loudest voice in his mind. There was no defense against it, no public statements, no lawyers, no cold notes in business. Newspapers. Nothing could silence the question throbbing within him. Who am I when no one believes in me? For the first time, he stopped going to parties. He declined invitations. He spent nights alone in his glass apartment, watching the city lights that seemed to mock his loneliness. The expensive dinners lost their flavor. The rarest glasses of wine failed to warm him, and not even the mounting figures in his accounts brought him solace. He began walking, without bodyguards, without a luxury car. He walked ordinary streets, mingling with the crowd, as if searching for meaning in anonymous faces he had never found in boardrooms. He discovered the popular market where she bought fruit. He discovered neighbors who spoke of her with quiet respect, describing her as someone who helped others despite having next to nothing. Every detail he heard was like a sharp blade. While he had built an empire on profits and strategy, she had built her dignity through simple gestures, small acts of resistance. Little by little, Richard realized that true wealth lay not in what he could buy, but in what he could not control: genuine respect, memory, gratitude. It was in this process that he discovered himself as human. A man who no longer knew whether he wanted to be remembered for the brilliance of his business or the shadow he left on the lives of others. In the silence of the early morning hours, he confessed to himself. It was she, the young woman with calloused hands and steady eyes, who had revealed him. She had transformed him not with speeches but with absence, and in that emptiness he began to be born again. Their reunion didn't take place in a grand ballroom, nor in a sophisticated cafe. The city, in its quiet irony, chose a simple setting: a cold afternoon at a Brooklyn community market. Richard was walking among makeshift stalls, breathing in the scent of fresh bread and spices, when he saw her. She was there with her back to him, arranging boxes of fruit at a small stand that didn't belong to her alone. She shared the space with other women, as if she'd found a way to multiply her presence in the community. His heart raced. There were no photographers, no audience, no weight of bets or headlines. Just her, in her essence, living what she had always been: hard work, quiet dignity. He approached slowly, as if fearing breaking glass. When she finally noticed him, it took a moment to speak. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. There was no anger in her gaze, but neither was there tenderness. Only the calm firmness of someone who no longer owed anything to anyone. "You sought me out," she said bluntly. Richard took a deep breath. "Yes, because since you left, I've realized it wasn't you who needed me. It was I who needed you." The words came out unvarnished, devoid of arrogance. For the first time, he spoke not as a millionaire, but as a man. She watched him silently, as if measuring not the phrases but the gestures that underpin them. Around them, life went on. Children ran between stalls, vendors called customers, the noise of the city pulsated. But between them, all was still. Richard tried to explain. He told her how he had read about her mother, how he had discovered the connection between his family and her pain, how it had stripped him of all certainties. "I don't want to clean up my image, nor buy your approval," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that I've changed." The young woman didn't. Smiled, didn't cry, wasn't immediately moved. He simply took a deep breath, rested his hands on the wooden box and replied, "People don't change because they want to. They change when forced by the weight of truth. The question is whether you'll stay changed when no one's looking." The reunion, in short, didn't bring easy answers. It only brought the possibility of a new beginning, uncertain, fragile, but real. The cold wind blew through the narrow streets of Brooklyn, sending dry leaves dancing around their feet. Richard waited in silence, each second stretching like an eternity. He expected a verdict, a gesture, anything to lift the weight he carried. But she took her time. The young woman remained still, as if she understood that some decisions need to mature calmly, not in haste. Her eyes fixed on him not with hatred, but with something harder to bear. Clarity. "You say you've changed," she began, her voice firm and low, almost like a restrained prayer. "But change isn't a sentence. It's living every day differently, even when no one is watching." Richard swallowed, realizing that any response from him would seem small compared to the gravity of the moment. Then she took a step forward, close enough for him to feel her breath mingling with the chilly air. "I don't hate you, I never have. I've only learned not to expect anything from you or people like you. What has sustained me this far wasn't the help of the rich, but my own resilience." The words fell like blades, but they weren't spoken with rancor. They were a tearless farewell, a sentence pronounced calmly. Richard tried to hold her gaze, but felt the vertigo of someone about to lose something they never quite possessed. "So this is it," he murmured, almost in a whisper. The young woman took a deep breath. "This is it. I've already forgiven myself so as not to carry chains. Goodbye is what I leave you." She turned slowly, walking toward their shared booth. There was no audience, no applause, no spectacle, only her decision, simple and immovable, outlined in firm steps that receded. Richard remained still, as if the world had stopped too. He finally understood that some losses are definitive, and that poetic justice does not scream. It only imposes itself in silences that no one can buy. Night fell over New York, and the lights of the buildings reflected on the wet asphalt, like rivers of gold shattered into 1,000 pieces. Richard walked alone, without security, unhurried, carrying only the weight of silence. Passing a street stall, he stopped in front of a fruit crate. He picked up a red apple, wiped it with the white handkerchief he once used at millionaire meetings, and raised it to his lips, wordlessly. In the reflection of the window behind the stall, he saw his own image, no longer the imposing man in the impeccable suit, but someone ordinary, crisscrossed by invisible scars. Across the city, the young woman was closing her small stall, packing the fruit with the same care as always. Before turning off the light, she raised her eyes to the sky and let out a light, brief smile, unseen by anyone. There was no reunion planned, no promises, just two destinies forever connected, each following its own path. The city, indifferent, continued its rhythm of haste and honking, but between the skyscrapers and the rain-stained sidewalks, a gesture remained suspended. An apple picked up from the ground, a symbol of a world that breaks and yet finds meaning in silence. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.